Want to stay up to date with everything that's happening on the show? Or do you have a story that you'd like to submit for one of our Listener Stories episodes? You can get in touch with the show via the website at www.hauntedukpodcast.com, on Instagram at hauntedukpodcast, on X at hauntedukpod, or you can email us at contactus@hauntedukpodcast.com. We're also on Facebook and TikTok. And if you want to support the show, you can do it via either Patreon or Ko-fi. Both platforms have exactly the same content, but work in slightly different ways. One of the advantages of Patreon is its sleek user interface, but if you want to avoid those pesky additional charges Apple, Google, and Patreon apply to your subscription, then why not give Ko-fi a try? Simply open a browser window and type ko-fi/Haunted UK Podcast. That's Ko-fi/Haunted UK Podcast, and you'll soon find us. Whichever platform you choose, we're sure you'll enjoy the bonus content. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the episode. Amelia lay awake for what seemed like hours, and with her windows closed but the shutters open, she decided to gaze out her window and admire the beautiful moonlit countryside. Amelia's bedroom window gave her an ideal view of the large lawn and the border of trees, which stood between Croglin Grange and the old graveyard. As her eyes scanned the silhouettes and shapes cast by the moonlight, she noticed that two small bright lights had now appeared in the tree line. These lights were moving through the trees and steadily towards the lawn. But what were they? Eyeshine from an animal? Possibly a fox? Amelia doubted it, as the lights appeared to be too high off the ground to be any animal. This is episode 58 of the Haunted UK podcast, and in this episode, we're going in search of vampires in the UK. For those of you who enjoy a good horror film, the possibility that you've watched one about a vampire is very likely. The most famous vampire of them all, Dracula, was the product of Bram Stoker, who in 1897 published his book of the same name, to mostly positive reviews. Whilst many praised its use of horror and the depiction of its characters, others felt that it was too frightening and too gory. But Dracula went on to become one of the most famous books and stories of all time, and still proves popular today. Stoker allegedly based the main character Dracula on the Romanian prince Vlad the Impaler, otherwise known as Vlad III, from the House of Dracula. Although he is considered a hero in Romania, surrounding territories would have you believe that he was a mass-murdering psychopathic masochist. His reputation for his delight in the torture of not only his enemies, but of his own people, is legendary. Stories circulated freely of Vlad dining in amongst those who he had ordered impaled on large wooden stakes, which were stuck into the ground. He would not only impale men, but also women and children, showing no mercy to his victims. Woodcut prints in books which were published in Germany in the late 1400s would depict this horrific torture, showing Vlad amongst the dead and dying. He invented many ways of torturing people, including his use of a large copper cauldron. He would have people put inside the cauldron and then put a large wooden lid on top to stop them getting out. But his cruelty was so perverse that he had holes cut in the lid so that those inside were forced to put their heads through. They were then fastened in this position, and a fire would be lit beneath the cauldron, and Vlad would listen to the horrific screams as he watched his victims boil to death. Vlad was also rumored to drink the blood of his victims in a show of gore and sadism, and according to legend, would regularly wash his hands in this blood before he sat down to eat. But is all of this true? Many historians believe that many of these rumors were either made up or highly exaggerated by the Transylvanian Saxons, who had a history of conflict with Vlad and his forces. But it's fair to say that the many things that Vlad was alleged to have done influenced the legend of the vampire as we know it today. According to vampire lore, these creatures can heal their wounds much quicker than any normal human, can shapeshift. They do not die of old age or disease, and to aid their longevity, they will drink the blood of the living. Vampires do, however, have their weaknesses. They can be killed by a number of different methods, including decapitation, exposure to sunlight, being burned alive, and the most popular, a wooden stake through the heart. Folklore and movies show vampires being repelled by things like crucifixes, holy water, garlic, and even running water, and it is believed that a vampire cannot enter a home unless invited. As unbelievable as many of these things sound, including the idea of the vampires actually walking the earth, numerous archaeological discoveries go some way in proving that many cultures really did have vampires walking amongst them, and their graves have been discovered. In Bulgaria, the skeletons of over 100 people were found, and then carefully the ground surrounding them was excavated, revealing something quite terrifying. All of them had been stabbed through the chest with various makeshift weapons, such as iron rods and parts from farming equipment such as plows. In Venice, the skeleton of a female was unearthed with what was discovered to be a brick forced into her mouth. The burial site was dated as far back as the 16th century, and this was widely considered to be an act of vampire slaying. Graves have also been discovered in Germany, with the heads of the bodies decapitated and purposely placed between the feet or behind the buttocks. Some heads of the victims were even buried away from the bodies themselves, and this was seen as a method to help the vampire's soul leave the body, stopping them from potentially rising from the dead. An interesting story came from movie director John Landis, famous for films such as The Blues Brothers, Trading Places, and Coming to America. But one movie which Landis will always be remembered for is An American Werewolf in London, released in 1981. But it was just over a decade before this that Landis got the initial idea through a very strange set of circumstances. Circumstances which parallel that of the vampire legend. During the late 60s, John Landis was working as a production assistant on the movie Kelly's Heroes, which was released in 1970. Whilst returning from filming on location, Landis was in the back of a car with a Yugoslav member of the film crew travelling through Yugoslavia when they came upon a group of around 12 people at a crossroads. This area was very rural and off the beaten track, but instead of driving past and not daring to take notice, they decided to pull the car over to see what was going on. It was a group of Romany gypsies who were performing some type of ceremony around a large hole which had been dug in the ground. Landis asked his Yugoslav colleague if he could ask these people what they were doing and why they were doing it. Suddenly, a body wrapped in a shroud was brought to the side of the hole. It had ropes of garlic and rosaries around it and was then lowered down vertically into the hole. Landis was told that this man had committed a crime, and his burial in this fashion was to ensure that his body didn't come back to life, escape the grave, and cause mischief. Very much like that of a vampire. Landis was not only shocked that this was taking place right in front of him, but he was also struck by a strange dichotomy in that this type of ceremony was still being performed, just as NASA was about to land a man on the moon. And that is the point. If those people still firmly believed that the body of that person could possibly come back to life and walk the earth after death, who's to say that the legend of the vampire is only that? A legend. As hard to believe as it is, there are many stories of real vampires terrorizing communities all over the world, and some of them are very recent, and some are here in the UK. So in this episode, we're going to delve into some of these truly amazing and equally frightening stories. But we'll first travel to the village of Kisilava in Serbia. It's 1725, and it's important to understand that around this time in history, vampires were considered to be very real. In this small village, a man named Peter Plogojewicz had passed away, leaving a wife and son. This death was treated as any normal passing would, with the body being buried and the family paying their respects. But this is where things began to get very frightening. 3 days later, Peter was at the door of his house, demanding food from his terrified son. His son soon buckled and gave his father food, then watched as his dead father walked away. The next day, Peter returned again, first of all to ask for his shoes from his stunned wife, and then to ask for more food, but this time his son refused. Peter fixed his son with a dark, threatening look, and then left. Peter's wife and son thought that this was the end of this strange and eerie set of incidents, but they were wrong. The next morning, Peter's son's dead body was discovered in the house, drained of blood. His wife, in complete panic, fled to another village in an attempt to escape any possibility that her dead husband would target her next, and she was right to do so. In just a matter of a few days, 9 other villagers would be found dead, all with the same injuries and cause of death as Peter's son. According to witnesses, all of the victims complained about severe exhaustion, and all of them had allegedly told of strange dreams in which Peter Plogojewicz would visit them. Every single one of the bodies had been almost completely drained of blood. The remaining villagers were understandably terrified and looked to their local parish priest for guidance and answers. To try and calm an already highly panicked village, the parish priest wrote a letter to the closest magistrate, informing him of this horrific set of murders, but also of the belief that they were committed by a suspected vampire. Upon receiving the letter, the magistrate took action and informed the commanding officer of a group of troops who were stationed nearby. The officer decided to travel to the village personally, so along with 2 soldiers and an executioner, they made their way to Kisilava. After meeting up with the parish priest and a group of local villagers, it was decided that Peter Plogojewicz's body should be exhumed, as well as all of his victims. One by one, all of the corpses were dug up and their injuries checked, as well as their levels of decomposition. Every single one, including Peter's son, had clear, visible signs of natural decomposition. But when Peter Plogojewicz's body was removed from its grave, A very disturbing sight greeted those present. His body showed no signs of decomposition at all. In fact, it was said that he looked like he'd just been buried. But that wasn't the only strange thing that the people saw. Peter's mouth was covered in blood, as if he'd just drained another victim. The commanding officer, along with the parish priest, instructed the soldiers, the executioner, and the villagers who had gathered to rebury the victims, with one important order: to place garlic and whitethorn on their corpses to prevent them from becoming one of the undead. They then moved on to Peter Plagojewicz, whose final fate was truly horrific. A wooden stake was smashed into his chest, releasing what seemed like streams of fresh blood, which flowed everywhere. His body was then put upon a pyre and burned to ash. If you thought that vampires were only a product of Europe, then you'd be wrong. In a beautiful, picturesque part of Cumbria, not far from the Scottish border, is the village of Croglin. In this small, unassuming hamlet, a story of almost unbelievable horror allegedly took place in the 1870s. Croglin Grange was a large farmhouse nestled in acres of land on the outskirts of the village. It was owned by the Fisher family, who were financially comfortable, and their descendants had lived in the house for generations. But by the 1870s, the Fisher family had outgrown Croglin Grange and were in search of a new home. They decided to move south near Guildford, but instead of selling Croglin Grange, they would let it out. The family could have easily stayed in the house by adding another floor, but they didn't want to ruin the character and look of their beloved family home, so it was left as it was. After a brief search for new tenants, the Fishers were contacted by a family called the Cranswells. Two brothers called Edward and Michael, and their sister Amelia, impressed the Fishers and a tenancy was agreed. Edward, Michael and Amelia soon moved into Croglin Grange and began to settle into the property and also the village. Neighbours, both rich and poor, would speak very highly of the Cranswells, saying that they were a valuable addition to their little country neighbourhood. And as the first autumn, winter and spring passed, Edward, Michael and Amelia grew to love Croglin Grange more and more. Within view of the Grange was a graveyard and chapel, which had once belonged to the Howard family, who still owned a lot of land in the surrounding area, and it was in this graveyard that strange events would begin. That summer the heat was stifling, and it seemed to be getting hotter and hotter, and one particular day was so unbearable that the three siblings couldn't even manage to do their daily chores and jobs. Instead, Edward and Michael would try to cool down in the shade of nearby trees, leaving Amelia on the veranda. As day turned to night, the air was still incredibly thick with heat, and after dinner, as the three sat on the veranda, they began to appreciate the beauty of the moonlight as it bathed the large lawn of Croglin Grange. The lawn extended to the tree line, which was where the graveyard of the chapel was located, and these trees acted like a border for both properties. As the night wore on, all three would eventually retire to their bedrooms and try to get some sleep in the uncomfortable, humid and sticky night heat. Amelia lay awake for what seemed like hours, with her windows closed but the shutters open. She decided to gaze out her window and admire the beautiful moonlit countryside. Amelia's bedroom window gave her an ideal view of the large lawn and the border of trees, which stood between Croglin Grange and the old graveyard. As her eyes scanned the silhouettes and shapes cast by the moonlight, she noticed two small bright lights had now appeared in the tree line. These lights were moving through the trees and steadily towards the lawn. But what were they? Eyeshine from an animal? Possibly a fox. Amelia doubted it, as the lights appeared to be too high off the ground to be any animal. As she continued to watch, these lights moved closer and closer to the edge of the lawn. She was suddenly struck with a terrifying fear like nothing she'd ever felt before. A figure made its way from the cover of the trees onto the lawn, and it was moving towards the house. Frozen to the spot, Amelia realized that the lights were in fact the figure's eyes, and it was still coming towards the house and towards her window. But then it suddenly turned and changed direction, as if it was going around the house. Amelia knew that her window was locked, but the door to her room, which led directly outside, was unlocked. She quickly snapped out of the terror that was gluing her to the spot, jumped from her bed and ran to the door. She turned the key in the lock, and for a brief moment Amelia felt safe. But then she heard scratching and picking noises coming from the window. The figure was stood right outside her bedroom, and it was picking at the lead that held the panes of glass in the window frame. Amelia was so petrified that she couldn't even scream, couldn't make the slightest sound. She just stood there and watched as the figure pushed one of the small panes of glass out of the frame. It crashed to the floor and shattered into pieces. Then a hand with long bony fingers reached in and unlocked the window. In an instant, the figure had leapt through the open window and into Amelia's bedroom. The being looked thin, wrinkled, its skin horrifically shriveled and stretched over its bones, and its blazing eyes were fixed on Amelia. She backed away to her bed and fell onto it, enabling the being to clamber onto her, running its long, shriveled fingers through her hair and pulling her head back to expose her neck. It then bit into her flesh and began to drink the blood which was seeping from the wound. Somehow, Amelia managed to let out a loud scream, which was heard by her brothers, but her internal adjoining door was locked. As both Edward and Michael tried desperately to prise the door open,
Amelia! Amelia!
The being bit down harder and deeper, drawing more blood from a now unconscious Amelia. The brothers finally managed to break the door open.
Amelia! Amelia!
There he is! Oi!
But only caught sight of the back of the being as it began to run towards the tree line. One of the brothers gave chase, but was shocked at how quickly this horrific creature could move.
He's gone.
Within no time at all, it was past the tree line, had cleared the graveyard wall, and was gone.
He's gone.
The brothers were convinced that Amelia's attacker was a vampire, and took her to the village doctor, who cleaned and dressed her wound. The doctor advised the brothers take Amelia away so that she could recover and regain her strength. So, they went to Switzerland. But all the time they were away, Amelia had convinced herself that it wasn't any such creature as a vampire that attacked her. It was an escaped lunatic. The brothers were more than happy to stay in Switzerland, but Amelia protested that they had taken a 7-year tenancy out on Croglin Grange, but had only been there for 1 year, and they should go back and see out their time. Autumn came and went, and the brothers finally agreed to go back to Croglin, because in truth, they were also missing life back in England. The 3 siblings returned and spent the winter happily continuing their jobs and interests, but with a few small differences. The brothers now slept with loaded pistols in case of another attack, and Amelia always kept her window shutters closed, even though they didn't cover the top panes of glass. Although nothing happened at Croglin Grange, throughout the winter and into the early spring, villagers were met with a series of horrific mutilations when a number of animals were found with huge perforations ripped into their throats. But so far, no more attacks on humans had been reported. But that was about to change. One evening in March, a noise began to stir Amelia from her sleep. A familiar noise, a noise which had chilled her to her bones. It was the noise of scratching and clicking at her window. Sitting up in bed, Amelia was horrified to meet the terrifying stare of the same creature that had attacked her all those months ago. It had unlocked and opened the shutters and was picking at the lead in the window, trying to remove another pane of glass. Amelia let out a loud scream before the creature could even finish its task, and this alerted her brothers, who stormed into her room with their pistols. By this time, the being had already fled, but Amelia's brothers were quick to open the door and gave chase. They were no match for the creature's speed, but one of the brothers fired a shot and managed to hit it in the leg, but it got away, fleeing into the darkness. As morning broke, the brothers decided to take matters into their own hands by alerting their neighbors and other villagers of the attack. And it was then that they were told that this wasn't an isolated incident. The vampire had attacked others. One victim was the young daughter of the inhabitants of Croglin High Hall, who'd apparently been bitten a number of times by this elusive vampiric creature. It had fed on her blood and left multiple bite wounds on her neck, but somehow she managed to survive her ordeal. The young girl's father joined the brothers and other villagers in an effort to hunt the creature down and kill it. One of the groups had heard stories that this vampire was using a family vault in the church's graveyard as its lair, so that's where they started their search. It wasn't long before they found the vault, and as the others stood back with their pistols ready, the brothers forced the door to the vault open and were immediately hit by a terrible smell. As they all made their way down the steps and into the vault, they found numerous coffins, all broken open, with the remains of the bodies horrifically mutilated and scattered all around. But one coffin was perfectly preserved, without a scratch on it. The group gathered around the coffin and prized the lid open, and there, right before their eyes, was the vampire who'd been terrorizing the village. This strange, tall, bony creature with dry and shriveled skin lay in the coffin in some sort of sleep state, and there on its leg was the bullet wound which had been inflicted by one of the brothers as they chased it from Croglin Grange. It was decided by all that the vampire must be burned, so right there, in the vault where it slept, the coffin of the Croglin Vampire was set alight, and the creature burned. There were never any other attacks or sightings of the vampire, but one strange story did emerge from nearby Croglin Low Hall. In the early years of the 1900s, the hall suffered a devastating fire which gutted the dining room. The family living there at the time rebuilt the room and its chimney, but in doing so, they discovered the burnt body of a human being. They had no knowledge at all of how this person had come to be in the chimney, and it was too ravaged by the fire to be identified. The father of the family wanted the body removed and given a Christian burial, but he died before this could happen, and it's speculated that the body is still in the chimney. Rumors also circulated that this could have been another vampire hiding out after learning the fate of the one in the vault in the church graveyard. But this was just speculation, wasn't it? It seems that towns near the England-Scotland border have some sort of supernatural draw for the creature known as the vampire. Berwick-upon-Tweed is another such town, nestled just 2.5 miles from the Anglo-Scottish border. It has the title of being the most northerly town in England. Berwick has also had a very violent and troubled history, changing hands between English and Scottish rule a number of times, the last being in 1482, when Richard of Gloucester, who would later be Richard III, reclaimed it for the English crown. Although the village is firmly in England, many of its population have a strong link to its Scottish neighbour. This northeast coastal town also has a terrifying history involving not one, but two vampires. The first was at a time when the Black Death was sweeping across Europe and Great Britain, decimating populations and striking fear into every man, woman and child. A wealthy merchant and landowner became infected by the plague and died not long after. The local townsfolk believed this man to be honest, generous and deeply religious, so he was given a burial by the church in consecrated ground. But it wasn't long before rumours began to surface about what he was really like. It turned out that he was very corrupt and had upset many people with his underhand business practices. The decision was made to exhume his body and rebury him in unconsecrated ground, a decision that the townsfolk would come to regret very quickly. Within a few days of the merchant's reburial, 2 young children went missing and were found dead, their bodies in a terrible state. Almost every night, adults and children would continue to go missing, their bodies found mutilated with horrific injuries to their throats. Whatever or whoever was responsible for these terrifying acts needed to be stopped. And it was one evening that a group of townsfolk finally saw who was responsible for this spate of gruesome murders. It was the merchant. A pack of dogs were let loose to hunt him down, and as he ran from them, it is said that he shouted,
"Until my body is burnt, you folk of Berwick shall have no peace!"
He escaped the dogs, but couldn't escape his eventual fate. Locals found that he was leaving the site of his grave most nights, hunting for the blood and flesh of humans, and now they knew the location of his lair. They could kill him. A group of 10 men were given the task of killing the merchant vampire and ridding the town of the horror which he had brought to them. The men waited until dusk one early evening and gathered at the vampire's unmarked grave. They began to dig him up and found that he was perfectly preserved with no signs of decomposition at all. The merchant was dragged from his grave and viciously hacked to pieces with spades and pitchforks. The men then lit a fire and burned the remains until there was nothing left. Some said that even after his execution was dealt out, the merchant's voice could still be sometimes heard, screaming in agony. Hundreds of years passed before the second vampire appeared in Berwick, and it wasn't too long ago. In the early 1900s, a lady called Betty Hoff was viciously murdered at a public house called the Royal. At the time, she was seeing a man named Colin McFadden, and together they'd been drinking and enjoying each other's company when Betty needed to visit the toilet. The toilet in this establishment was literally just a wooden shack with a piece of wood inside with a hole in it, so not the most hygienic of places. Nonetheless, when you have to go, you have to go. Betty disappeared, leaving Colin inside the pub. Around 10 minutes had passed, and there was still no sign of Betty, when 2 women came in from outside, complaining that they were waiting to use the toilet, but it was locked, and whoever was inside wasn't answering. A number of men, including Colin and the pub's landlord, went outside to try and find out what was going on. The door was indeed locked, and there was no answer from Betty inside. The landlord charged the door and broke it down, and found a truly horrific sight. There was Betty, with a huge gash across her throat and her blood all over the inside of the wooden hut. The wound to Betty's neck was so deep and severe that whoever had done this to her had pushed her head so far back that her neck was completely exposed. There seemed no evidence of a forced entry, and the door was locked from the inside. It was clear to the landlord, the locals, and Colin that this was the work of another vampire. Rumours of such a creature roaming the town had surfaced when a number of lambs had been found with their throats ripped open and drained of blood. But these incidents were nervously put down to animal attacks, not vampires. That was until the murder of Betty Hoff. Weeks passed before the vampire struck again, and this time it was a 16-year-old girl who was the target. She was out on a farm track picking apples. Her mother had told her that she was to be back home before dusk, but as the girl continued to pick apples, she lost all track of time, and it wasn't long before darkness was closing in. Cautiously, the young girl began to make her way home, but as she made her way along the farm track, she noticed a figure a short distance away, moving towards her. As the figure got closer, the girl could see it was a man. A very tall man, over 6 feet, wearing dark and dirty clothes. As they passed each other, the man suddenly turned and grabbed the girl, pushing her to the floor, then moving on top of her. As he opened his mouth, the terrifying young girl was shocked to see 2 very large and long canine-type teeth. The man then pulled the girl's head back and moved in to bite her neck, but the girl let out a piercing scream which alerted the attention of 2 farmers who were out working. They ran over and pulled the man off the girl, fighting with him until they had him under control. He was taken to be dealt with by the police, who held him until he could be seen by a magistrate. After the young girl had given her account of what had happened to her, as well as the murder of Betty Hoff, it was the magistrate's decision to send the man, who was then revealed to be a known pauper of the parish, Archibald Haydon, to stand trial for murder and attempted rape. The magistrate didn't believe for 1 minute that he was dealing with a vampire, but instead a violent madman. But as Haydon was being escorted away from the magistrate by guards, his vampiric tendencies boiled to the surface once more, and he attacked a guard, viciously biting at his throat and ripping it wide open. The other guards looked on in complete shock and terror, and this gave Archibald Haydon time to make a run for it. But his eventual fate was something that he couldn't run from forever. Back in Berwick, news of the escaped vampire had reached the locals, and it was Colin McFadden who gathered together a mob to hunt him down and to finally bring peace back to the town. A number of sniffer dogs were also used to help with the search, and quickly they picked up a strong scent at the edge of some woodland. The mob followed the dogs into the woods, and they were eventually led to a large tree with a hole which seemed to lead to some sort of underground lair. The immediate area also had the remains of a fire, as well as numerous dead animals strewn about, all of which had been drained of their blood. It was clear that this was a place where the vampire Archibald Haydon was hiding out. One of the mob reached into the hole and jumped back in shock. He said that he grabbed a hold of what he thought was the foot of a person. Armed with shovels, a number of men began to dig down into the hole, and they were quickly able to drag Haydon out and make a citizen's arrest. But before he could be led away, Colin McFadden swung his shovel with all of his strength and almost completely decapitated Haydon. This was all the mob needed, and they began to stab, slash, beat and mutilate Archibald Haydon until there was just a pile of bloody remains scattered around the woodland floor. Led by McFadden, the mob then built a fire and burnt the remains, making sure that there was no way that the vampire could ever return. But was this what really happened in this particular story? Or was someone else to blame for the death of Betty Hoff? It is theorized that the killer could have been none other than McFadden himself. It is widely known that both McFadden and Hoff were in a relationship together, but they were also in business together. Hoff was a prostitute, and McFadden was her pimp. They were also known to have very explosive arguments, and maybe it was one of these that led to Betty's violent death. it's not out of realms of possibility for McFadden to have followed Betty out of the toilet hut, slit her throat, pull her head back, and then climb out of the hut roof. The blood all over the inside walls could have easily been from McFadden butchering Betty off, and not from a vampire feeding on its victim. There was even a water pump outside the public house, which he could have used to clean off most of the blood. Archibald Haydon was indeed a rapist, a pauper, and a town outsider, but also the ideal candidate for taking the blame for Betty's murder. It was McFadden who gathered the mob together, McFadden who helped lead the mob to Archibald Haydon's hideout, and McFadden who dealt the first and fatal blow. It stands a good chance that Haydon's crimes could have been common knowledge around Berwick, so it's not a stretch for the rumour mill to jump to even bigger conclusions about him. But this is all conjecture, so until some solid evidence presents itself, which by now remains very doubtful, Berwick could still have been the home of 2 vampires. Staying in this area, but hopping over the Scottish border, we now move on to the beautiful and picturesque town called Melrose and its stunning abbey. Just 37 miles away from Berwick, this town is also the location of a dark and disturbing story, which is still told today. Today the abbey is a partial ruin, but still an amazingly beautiful building which has stood since around 1136. It served as a Cistercian monastery, which was founded by King David I of Scotland in the same year. The monks who lived and worshipped there not only built the abbey but also brought new skills to the town, which benefited it financially. However, it was also the scene of many border disputes with the English. These disputes didn't go well for the abbey, as it suffered extensive damage in 1385 at the hands of the English, but was rebuilt in the late 14th and early 15th centuries into the truly stunning building which can be seen today. But we need to go all the way back to the 1100s and back to some of the first Cistercian monks for this particular account. Whilst most of the monks at the abbey used their time working and worshipping, one monk was much less interested in towing the party line, and instead lived a life of excess and indulgence. He was said to have been a drunk, a womanizer, and had an interest in hunting the local wildlife with his dogs. As this monk's unusual lifestyle began to get noticed more and more around the town, he was given the nickname of the Hunderprest, or the dog priest. This brought shame and ridicule to the monastery, and it wasn't long before all of this would finally catch up with him. In 1196, the monk passed away and was buried in the grounds of the abbey, but it wasn't long before locals began sharing stories of a grotesque human-like figure wearing the clothing of a Cistercian monk which roamed the town at night. It would feed on the blood of those it could capture and then let out horrific screams, which shattered the peace of the normally quiet nights. This creature was quickly identified as the deceased monk, and it was believed by many that his soul could not rest because of the sins that he'd committed. Tensions were already high in Melrose when the Hunderprest decided to pay a visit to a woman who he'd once had a relationship with. Being extremely familiar with the town, it didn't take him long to find her dwelling, and as silently as the dead, he managed to force his way inside. The Hunderprest found where his one-time mistress was sleeping, and as he prepared to attack, she woke up, screaming in horror at the sight of what was before her. The person who she once desired, now a horrid corpse with menacing eyes and a lust for blood and death. Her screams quickly got the attention of those living close by, and as a number of locals forced their way into her dwelling, they managed to force the vampire out into the night, where it fled and vanished into the darkness. Even as those locals comforted the distressed young woman, the Hunderprest had another target in mind: the abbey, and the monks who once tried to be such an integral part of his life, but failed because of his inability to control his sinful needs. With a viciousness that shocked the monks at the abbey, the Hunderprest pounded and pounded at the door, screaming to be let in.
Let me in.
But the monks held fast, and as they pushed hard against the dark, evil force that was trying to gain entry, they began to pray. It was their belief that the power of their prayers revolted the creature and sent it on its way. But this would only be for a short while. The vampire monk once again tried to feed on the blood of his former lover, but as before, her screams alerted the locals, who rushed to her rescue and drove the creature away. Terrified for their safety, the townsfolk gathered and made their way to Melrose Abbey, where they demanded that the monks take action against this unholy threat. It was the bravery of 4 monks, who took on the responsibility of ridding the town of this vampire, that turned the tide in their favor. They decided to begin their duty by fasting and praying, a spiritual preparation that would give them strength. They then began a vigil in the burial grounds of the abbey, waiting for the Hunderprest to appear, and before long, he did just that, but not in the way that they expected. As the moonlight began to cast shadows over the burial ground, one shadow in particular seemed to be moving. Then, in an instant, the form of a large bat took shape and flew towards a grave. The grave of a monk. There, it morphed into the now familiar vampire and stood at its grave while the monks looked on. They quickly devised a plan to finally end the terror that this creature was holding over the town. 3 of them would stay out of sight, whilst the 4th would be the bait to draw the vampire into the open and away from the safety of its grave. All of the monks carried either an axe or a staff for protection, so with their faith and their weapons ready, they went ahead with their plan. The brave monk stood up and began to walk towards the vampire, and was shocked when it turned to face him. Never before had he seen a creature like this, and as he tried to regain his composure, he was stunned by the speed of it, as it seemed to manifest itself in front of him in no time at all. With all of his will, the monk swung his axe and struck a heavy blow to the creature, who seemed to stagger backwards from the force of the impact. The vampire then quickly retreated after seeing the other monks now making their way towards it, knowing that it was now vulnerable in the open. As it got to its grave, the Hunderprest seemed to dissolve into the soil beneath him, leaving the monks alone in the darkness of the burial ground. It was clear to the monks that they should return at daylight and put an end to the reign of this vampire, and that is exactly what they did. As the sun rose above the horizon, the monks gathered around the grave of the vampire and began digging down to its coffin. As the monks pulled the coffin from its resting place, they all knew what they had to do. They prized the lid open, and to their horror, there was the Hunderprest vampire, blood around its mouth, in a state of living death, sleeping soundly. The man who was once part of the monks' monastic order, the man who had fell into sin and lived a life not worthy of his title, was now laid out before them, a creature of unspeakable evil. The monks pulled the vampire from its coffin and set it ablaze, watching it burn, and eventually turn to ash. They then cast the ashes of the creature into the wind and hoped and prayed that they had seen the last of the Hunderprest vampire. There are a few variations to this story. Time has passed, so this is to be expected, yet all of them tell the same tale in a roundabout way. A tale which is still passed down from generation to generation, serving as a warning to some, but a reminder to others that evil can be vanquished if you have the courage and the faith to fight it. Our last story involving these creatures of darkness happened fairly recently and is quite well known, especially in occult circles. From the borders of England and Scotland, we finish our travels down in London, Highgate to be precise, and a story which has it all: a vampire, witnesses, and even vampire hunters. Highgate Cemetery is located in North London in the borough of Camden. It was opened in 1839 and covers an area of approximately 37 acres. It contains an estimated 53,000 graves, where the bodies of approximately 170,000 people rest in peace. The cemetery is split into two areas, east and west, and has many famous people buried there, including chemist Michael Faraday, actors Ian Holm and Bob Hoskins, philosopher Karl Marx, singer George Michael, writer Douglas Adams, famous for The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and even the mastermind behind the Great Train Robbery, Bruce Reynolds. The list of notables is huge, and they all rest in an environment which is a mixture of cared-for grounds, wildflowers and shrubbery, trees and beautifully constructed tombs and architecture. These include stunning tombs in the West Cemetery in the Circle of Lebanon, as well as the almost Indiana Jones movie-like entrance to the Egyptian Avenue. But it was also the West Cemetery which played host to an intriguing, frightening, and sometimes baffling vampire story: the Highgate Vampire. With so many burials and so many graves, it's not surprising that people have reported seeing ghostly figures roaming around the extensive grounds of Highgate. Witnesses have reported seeing an elderly woman with long flowing grey hair effortlessly floating between the graves, apparently in search of the final resting places of her children, which she allegedly viciously murdered. Another spectre seen by witnesses has been described as a skeletal figure who stands near the main entrance of the western side of the cemetery. Many people have also reported seeing the figure of a woman wearing a shroud and looking up at the sky. Looking as solid as any real person, witnesses get the shock of their lives when, as they approach her, she disappears, then reappears a short distance away, doing the same thing. But it was in the 1960s that rumours of something much darker was roaming around the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. It was also around this time that the cemetery had to declare itself bankrupt, so with no one tending to the grounds or graves, Highgate was soon taken back by nature. In July of 1965, a man by the name of Brian Bourne was out walking his dog through the Western Cemetery grounds. It was approximately 8 p.m. and he was due to go to a party later that evening. As Brian and his dog passed the western gate of the cemetery, the atmosphere surrounding them completely changed. Brian said that he felt a coldness sweep over him, and this was followed by an unnatural and unnerving stillness. As he stood there, he noticed what looked like a strange black liquid seeping from the cemetery wall. And as it gathered on the ground, it began to grow and form into a tall human-like figure. Brian said that it looked like it was wearing dark-coloured clothing, and judging by its size, it was a man. But the most disturbing thing about this terrifying figure was the face. It had no distinguishable facial features apart from its eyes, which Brian described as being like two red pits that glowed with growing intensity. His dog began growling at the figure shortly before the two of them ran for the gate and off out onto the street. Brian Bourne was convinced that what he saw was no ghost, but something else, something dark and evil. More sightings of a similar ominous entity began to be reported. In 1967, two young teenage girls were walking home along Swains Lane, which cuts straight through the cemetery, when they said that they witnessed figures appearing from a number of graves. This was near the North Gate, and near the same location that the figure of the tall man dressed in dark clothing and wearing a hat was also spotted. In the same year, Thomas O'Loughlin and his girlfriend were strolling through the cemetery when they spotted a large figure near the western gate, the same place where Brian Bourne had his experience 2 years earlier. They reported that this figure had a face which didn't look human, and as they distanced themselves from it and looked back, they watched it slowly disappear. Thomas was also astounded and puzzled by what they'd both seen that he persuaded a friend to accompany him back to the same spot the following night. As they were walking around the cemetery, they became aware of a strange, low-frequency booming sound, and then a dark, shadowy figure quickly passed in front of the pair, causing them to both run for the gate and back to their homes. As 1969 gave way to 1970, things began to take an even darker turn at Highgate, when witnesses started reporting the appearance of dead animals throughout the western cemetery. These were mainly foxes, but every single animal had the same deep cuts to their throats. This was seen as more evidence to prove that a creature such as a vampire was stalking the cemetery grounds. It was also reported that members of an occult group had been gathering in Highgate for many years, performing rituals and ceremonies linked to black magic and satanic worship, and it was these acts which were blamed by some for the appearance of the vampire. It was believed that in medieval Romania, a powerful nobleman who practiced the dark arts of black magic and satanic worship had gained a large number of dedicated disciples who followed his teachings. They would perform ancient and sacred rituals which were seen by God-fearing followers of the Christian faith as sinful. Upon the nobleman's death, his followers were instructed to move his body and burial coffin from Romania and relocate it to England. After many weeks of travelling, the disciples finally reached the settlement that would eventually become the London we see today, and the nobleman's coffin was reburied on the site of Highgate Cemetery. It was believed that the occult group knew of the nobleman and his burial, and the rituals and ceremonies which they were performing were to enable him to walk the earth once more. And it was around this time that another very notable sighting took place. Not willing to give his name for fear of ridicule, a man known only as Thornton reported the following disturbing encounter with the Highgate Vampire. Thornton had arrived at Highgate to have a look around one late afternoon purely out of interest. He wasn't a believer in ghosts, the paranormal or the supernatural, and had no interest in the stories which the cemetery was known for. As Thornton walked deeper and deeper around the maze of pathways that lay between the thousands of gravestones and tombs, he noticed that the daylight was slowly fading, so decided that it was probably time to leave. But he had no idea where the gate was. After wandering around for what seemed like hours, Thornton conceded that he was completely lost, but keeping his calm, he continued to search for the gate. But as he walked, he became incredibly paranoid that someone or something was behind him. Gathering his composure and doing his best to keep his nerves in check, he spun around and was met with a terrifying sight. Stood only a few feet away was the tall, dark, solid figure of some kind of horrific spectre, hovering a matter of just a few inches off the ground. Thornton said that whatever it was, it immediately emitted some sort of unknown hypnotic force which fixed him to the ground. As well as not being able to move, Thornton said that this force was so strong and intense that he became completely unaware of his surroundings and of the time that he was stood there for. A feeling of pure evil then filled Thornton, and he was convinced that this spectre was totally intent on doing him harm. After what seemed like minutes, the figure unexpectedly vanished, and Thornton was slowly but surely able to regain movement, and he eventually found the gate and left the cemetery. More reports of sightings of this vampire entity continued to roll in, and it was around this time that two men would become deeply involved in the legend of the Highgate Vampire. Both David Farrant and Sean Manchester had been following the stories of the strange entity at Highgate, and it was Farrant who on the 6th of February 1970 claimed that he'd witnessed a grey spectral figure inside the grounds of the cemetery. This written account was sent into the Hampstead and Highgate Express newspaper and was seized upon by Sean Manchester, who elevated Farrant's sighting from a spectre to a vampire and declared that he was the person to rid the creature from Highgate. But David Farrant wasn't going to let Sean Manchester take the credit that easily. He too asserted that he would destroy the entity, being careful not to call it a vampire, but having a small degree of belief that it could be a creature of that description. These were two very different men with very different backgrounds. David Farrant was an occultist who was the founder and president of the British Psychic and Occult Society. His interest and knowledge of black magic, witchcraft and the occult was extensive, and it was his belief that the blood-drained animals which were found in Highgate Cemetery were most likely the victims of ritual sacrifices being committed by the group of occultists, who were rumoured to be using the cemetery for their practices. Sean Manchester, on the other hand, was a very colourful character, an ordained bishop who belonged to a mysterious order known as the Old Catholic Church, which Manchester would state was not related to the Vatican at all. He was also a self-proclaimed ghost hunter, paranormal investigator, vampire hunter, and an exorcist. Sean Manchester also conducted a number of interviews with some of the witnesses of the vampire, who were prepared to come forward. First of all, he made contact with Thomas O'Loughlin and begged him to return with him to the exact location of his experience, but he flatly refused. Next up were the two teenage girls, who said that they'd witnessed several figures appearing from some of the graves. One of the girls, Elizabeth Wodgdiller, told Sean Manchester that ever since her experience in Highgate, she'd been suffering from crippling nightmares, and they were always the same. A tall, dark, almost skeletal entity who was always trying to break into her bedroom with nothing but evil intent. She also said that she had begun sleepwalking, something that she'd never done before, as well as episodes of dizziness and nausea. Manchester also spoke to Elizabeth's boyfriend Keith, and he confirmed that her skin tone had become much paler after the Highgate incident, and said she had been prescribed vitamins by her doctor, who also changed her diet in an attempt to help her feel less lethargic. But the most disturbing thing that Keith had noticed were the two puncture wounds which had appeared on Elizabeth's neck. Sean Manchester stated that he immediately gave Elizabeth a silver cross to wear around her neck, as well as hanging a crucifix in her bedroom. She was given garlic to place around the room, and holy water was used to bless the space. Both Sean and Elizabeth then engaged in prayer, and after just a short time, it was reported by Sean Manchester that Elizabeth made a full recovery. With both Farrant and Manchester continuing their separate investigations, and the media seemingly turning them against each other, the sightings continued. A man and a friend who were walking through the cemetery said that they'd come across a trail of blood which led to a tomb. They were then shocked to see a tall, dark figure enter the tomb and presumably go down to the vault. Two other people came forward reporting that they both saw a dark figure which seemed to rise up from the ground. It then took off at speed through the cemetery. Farrant and Manchester continued to pursue the creature as well as witnesses who'd seen it, and they also continued with their war of words with each other, both claiming that they were stalking the being and were close to ridding Highgate of this terrifying entity. The media seemed to lap this up, and when Sean Manchester claimed that both he and Farrant would join forces to hunt down the Highgate Vampire and kill it, everything went into overdrive. Thames Television would broadcast a TV special about the Highgate Vampire, which went out on Friday the 13th of February 1970. It also gave details of the scheduled vampire hunt, which was about to take place the next night, and which would involve both Farrant and Manchester. But before that could take place, the public decided to take the law into their own hands. Hysteria gripped the area, and within a matter of hours of the Thames television broadcast, hundreds of self-proclaimed vampire slayers had gathered outside Highgate Cemetery. Many of them were armed with hammers and homemade wooden stakes, and it wasn't long before the police got involved and tried to control the crowd, but it was no use. The police barriers that had been placed around the area to stop the public from invading the cemetery were quickly overrun and broken down, leading to hundreds flocking into Highgate Cemetery, searching for the vampire, but never finding it. The hysteria continued to boil around the Highgate Vampire, as did the feud between Farrant and Manchester, but it was in August of 1970 that this vampire story took a much darker turn. Two schoolgirls were walking through the Western Cemetery when they were horrified to discover the remains of a human corpse in the middle of a pathway. Whoever it was had been decapitated and had a stake driven through their chest. The police were called, and they found a grave which had been opened up. It was the final resting place of a woman who had died around 100 years earlier. Her coffin had been removed and her body taken out and horrifically mutilated. The police began an investigation, and this in turn led to more sightings of the tall, dark figure that had been roaming the grounds. Sean Manchester went on record stating that on 2 occasions he and a group of his followers broke into the graves of suspected vampires with the intent on killing them. The first happened when, after an attempt to prise open the door of some catacombs failed, ropes were used to gain access from above. These catacombs were identified as the possible resting place of a vampire by a witness. After finding what they considered to be an out-of-place black coffin, they performed an exorcism on it, using holy water and garlic, and then sprinkled salt around it. The second occasion was shortly after the corpse of the woman had been found. Again, Manchester and his followers were led to a particular family vault, this time by a psychic. After they had broken the door open and gained access, they were stunned to find what they described as the same black coffin that was in the catacombs. Manchester assumed that the coffin had been moved by the occult group who were performing black magic rituals in the cemetery. The lid of the coffin was forced open, and according to Manchester, what was found inside served as absolute confirmation of what we were dealing with. Sean Manchester wanted to end this at that moment by driving a stake through the heart of whatever was in that coffin, but he was stopped by his followers, who reminded him that the desecration of a corpse was illegal. Manchester saw sense, and instead he and the group performed a Latin ceremony, which was said to banish the evil spirit from this world. David Farrant felt that, in his opinion, after the corpse was found by the schoolgirls, this dark figure was now posing a very real threat to anyone entering the cemetery. So he gathered together members of the British Psychic and Occult Society, and they agreed to conduct a séance in the area where sightings had been most frequent. If the séance proved to be a success, Farrant would then perform an exorcism which would hopefully rid the cemetery of the being for good. But things didn't go as planned. Within minutes of the séance beginning, police raided the cemetery, causing the group to split up and make their escapes. Farrant also made a run for it, but was quickly apprehended and arrested. He stood trial, but the case was thrown out of court, and as the weeks turned to months, which turned to years, interest in the Highgate Vampire began to dwindle, but not for Farrant and Manchester. In early 1974, Sean Manchester officially put an end to the vampire story by claiming that he'd successfully tracked the creature to an old Gothic mansion on the borders of Highgate and Crouch End. Number 1 Avenue Road had long been the site of alleged practices of witchcraft, black magic, satanic worship, and demonic summoning ceremonies by various occult groups. So ominous was its reputation that it was even given the nickname the House of Dracula, and it was here that Sean Manchester would finally encounter the Highgate Vampire for the second time. Manchester wrote that he and his followers had made their way to 1 Avenue Road in the early hours of one cold morning, which by 1974 had been abandoned. Darkness was giving the group the cover they needed to remain as out of sight as possible, and they were pretty sure that the house wasn't being used by any occult groups at the time. They gained access to the large gothic pile and began to search room after room for signs of the vampire's lair. With no luck in any of the above-ground rooms, Sean Manchester led the way down to the basement. The group soon found what they were looking for: a coffin, a black coffin. The same coffin that they performed ceremonies on in both the catacombs and the vault. The group weren't going to make the same mistake twice, so they began to drag the coffin up the basement stairs. Getting it into the main house, Sean Manchester and the group noticed that it was getting light outside. They moved the coffin from the house and into the rear gardens. Of what happened next, Manchester is quoted as saying the following, quote, "Dawn was about to break, starting to send spears of bright illumination into the macabre spectacle below. When the lid was removed, we beheld the same thing we'd seen in August 1970. This was now the early part of 1974. Our quarry this time looked even more exaggerated, even more distorted than I remembered it, far worse than even that time in the Highgate vault. Its burning, fierce eyes under the many-furrowed brow were staring, yellow at the edges with blood-red centers unlike anything imaginable. The mouth was set in a cruel expression, the lips drawn back. With a mighty blow, a sharpened shaft of wood impaled the creature's heart. We witnessed the body shell cave in and quickly turn filthy brown, and that itself soon became a sluggish flow of inhumane slime and viscera in the bottom of the casket." End quote. To finally make sure that the vampire could never walk the earth again, the coffin and its contents were set ablaze. The group kept watch for hours as the fire roared, then slowly died down and finally went out. All that remained was scorched ground, ash, and a few bones. According to Manchester, these were ground down to a powder, and along with the ashes was scattered to the four winds of the earth. The Highgate Vampire was no more. The aftermath of these events never really settled down for either David Farrant or Sean Manchester, as both men took every opportunity to bait and goad each other. 1974 was also the year that David Farrant was found guilty of interfering with human remains and vandalism of memorials in Highgate Cemetery. He served a short prison sentence and after his release continued with his research and his work with the British Psychic and Occult Society. He died in 2019, aged 73 years old. As far as I can tell from research, Sean Manchester is still alive and still part of the old Catholic Church. Both men continued to trade insults until Farrant's death. Almost 2 decades have passed after the 1974 vampire slaying, with no activity at all. But then sightings of a tall, dark figure wearing a Victorian-style coat and hat began to surface. From the 1990s up to the present day, people are still seeing this entity. Interestingly, this all reminds me of our short haunt, The Shadow in the Cemetery, where a frightening entity with a foreboding top hat rises amid the graves and runs very fast. Are there parallels here? Let us know your thoughts. So back to 1974. Did the events in the house on Avenue Road really put an end to the Highgate Vampire? Or could there have been more than one? Who can be sure? But one thing is certain. Whether you believe any of these stories or not, And that is this. If you find yourself wandering around Highgate Cemetery, or indeed any cemetery for that matter, make sure you don't take the wrong path. That you know where the exit gates are, because if you become lost, the next person to encounter a vampire could be you. Do you have an interesting story which you'd be willing to share with the show? If so, your story could feature in our end of season Listener Stories episodes. Please get in touch with the show via email at contactus@hauntedukpodcast.com, marking the subject as Listener Story. We'll be waiting for you. As well as Patreon, you can also follow the Haunted UK Podcast on Twitter at Haunted UK Pod, on Instagram at Haunted UK Podcast, and also on our website at www.hauntedukpodcast.com. You'll be able to keep up to date with news and announcements, browse and download our episode scripts, get in contact with us, and much more. This episode was presented by Steve, produced by Pink Flamingo Home Studio. The script for this episode was edited by Marie Waller Proofreading. For more information about this service, contact Marie at mariewaller.proofreading@gmail.com. For a list of all research sources which we found helpful for the writing of this episode, please see the show's notes. Thank you again for listening to and supporting the Haunted UK podcast. So until the next episode, stay safe and take care.